Kirk to Rayborn, report. I'm required to make a security confirmation. When I call my ship, if you list your personnel, cargo requirements, any special needs...
Science fiction has always given writers a strange kind of freedom. Wrap a hard truth in a rubber-suited alien or set it on a planet 40 light-years away, and suddenly a network censor might wave it through without blinking. Star Trek understood this trick better than almost any show of its era. But every so often, the disguise wasn't enough. Some episodes went so far into disease, madness, cruelty, or defiance of social norms that broadcasters overseas simply refused to air them, and in one famous case, kept that refusal in place for nearly 3 decades. Today we're looking at 3 of those episodes, why they were pulled, and why, even now, it's not hard to see what made censors so nervous. The first episode on our list starts out looking like a fairly ordinary away mission mystery, and slowly turns into something considerably grimmer. The Enterprise picks up a distress call from a planet that, bizarrely, looks like a duplicate of Earth, right down to the layout of its towns and the design of its buildings. When Captain Kirk leads a landing party down to investigate, they find a town that seems frozen in an earlier decade, its streets completely empty, and its houses left exactly as they were the moment everyone disappeared. That eerie stillness doesn't last. A man staggers out of hiding, his face and body horribly disfigured, and lunges at the group before collapsing and dying in front of them. It's a jarring, ugly moment for a show that, up to that point in its run, had mostly kept its violence bloodless and its monsters at arm's length. Shortly after, the landing party encounters a wary, frightened child hiding in the ruins. She eventually gives her name as Miri, and it becomes clear she's been watching the newcomers from the shadows, unsure whether to trust them. Miri explains, in the fractured way a frightened kid might, that the adults on her world are gone, and that she and the other children left behind call themselves the onlys, because as far as they know, they're the only ones left. She refers to grown-ups using a slang term of her own, treating adulthood itself as something to be feared rather than admired. That inversion, children as the only rational, functioning members of a dead society, is part of what makes the episode so unsettling. It's not simply a horror story bolted onto a science fiction premise. It's built on the idea that growing up, in this particular corner of the universe, is a death sentence. Things get worse quickly. The crew realizes that whatever wiped out the adult population is still active, and to their horror, they notice the first signs of it developing on their own skin. Miri warns them that this is exactly how the plague always starts, a strange discoloration, followed by a rapid and total collapse of the person's reason, ending in a violent death within days. She describes watching it happen to every adult she ever knew, which is a remarkably dark thing for a children's hour science fiction show to ask a child actor to deliver on screen. The explanation the crew eventually uncovers only deepens the discomfort. The disease wasn't natural. It was the side effect of a scientific project meant to extend human lifespan, an experiment that went catastrophically wrong centuries earlier. The children of the planet aren't really children at all. They're survivors who have been alive for hundreds of years, aging at an almost imperceptible rate, trapped indefinitely in young bodies, while their minds continue to develop at something closer to a normal pace. It's a genuinely disturbing piece of science fiction logic. Bodies frozen in childhood, psychologically maturing into something between innocence and something much stranger, for centuries on end. As Dr. McCoy races to synthesize a cure before the disease claims the landing party too, the situation on the ground deteriorates. One of the older children, distrustful of the visitors and afraid of what will happen if the adults win, steals the crew's communicators, cutting off their only way of calling the ship for help. What follows is close to a full breakdown of order among the children, panic, mob behavior, and a genuinely tense sequence where they turn on members of the landing party out of fear rather than malice. It's a fight scene between adults and children, filmed for early evening television, and that alone tells you a lot about why a broadcaster somewhere down the line might have gotten nervous. Kirk eventually manages to talk the group down, appealing to their sense of responsibility for the youngest and most vulnerable among them, and the communicators are returned just in time for McCoy to test an experimental treatment on himself. It works mercifully, and the episode ends with something resembling hope for the planet's stranded population. None of that softened the reaction overseas. When Miri reached British television screens in the early 1970s, viewer complaints piled up quickly, and it became one of a small handful of episodes that broadcasters there quietly decided not to bring back for years afterward, citing the unusually heavy subject matter of a dead civilization, a disfiguring plague, and children menacing armed adults. What makes Miri such an interesting case study is how much of its power comes from suggestion rather than spectacle. There's very little in the way of elaborate effects work, no monster, no invading fleet, nothing you could point to as traditionally frightening in a science fiction sense. The horror is entirely conceptual, an entire world of adults wiped out, replaced by a population of children who are simultaneously innocent and ancient, living inside a countdown they don't fully understand. It's the kind of premise that works precisely because it lingers in a viewer's head well after the credits roll, and that lingering quality may be exactly why broadcasters uncomfortable with the episode's theme struggled to justify bringing it back once they'd pulled it. There's also something worth noting about the production side of the episode. The child actors carrying much of the episode's emotional weight were asked to perform material about disease, death, and the total collapse of adult society. Heavy subject matter for young performers, even by the standards of prestige drama, let alone a network science fiction adventure show. That choice alone tells you something about how far the writers were willing to go in service of the story, and it's part of why Miri still gets singled out today whenever fans discuss the more unsettling corners of the original series. So what's another original series episode that ended up facing the same kind of resistance? Let's take a look. Few single scenes in Star Trek's history have generated as much conversation as the one at the center of this next episode. The plot itself involves Kirk and Communications Officer Uhura being held captive by a society of telepathic aliens who have modeled their entire culture after ancient Greek philosophy, complete with togas, banquets, and an obsession with using their mental powers to control anyone who crosses them. Using that telepathic ability, the aliens force members of the crew to act against their own will, turning Kirk and Uhura's bodies into puppets for the amusement of their captors. In the middle of that forced performance comes the moment the episode is remembered for. Kirk and Uhura are made to move toward each other and kiss, a scene that is frequently cited as one of the first interracial kisses broadcast on American television. It lasted only a few seconds on screen, but its ripple effects went well beyond the confines of a single hour of 1960s science fiction. The context matters here too. This wasn't a romantic choice by either character, but something imposed on them against their will by outside forces, which somewhat complicates its legacy as a romantic milestone even as it remains a landmark moment for representation. What's often left out of the story is how differently American and British audiences reacted to it. On the American side, network executives braced for backlash, worried in particular about how affiliate stations in more conservative parts of the country would respond. In the end, that backlash mostly failed to materialize. Complaints were far fewer than anticipated, suggesting the audience was more ready for the moment than the people running the network gave them credit for. The reaction across the Atlantic went the other way entirely. When British broadcasters got around to considering the episode for air, they declined to show it at all, and kept declining for the better part of 30 years. The official explanation given at the time focused on the episode's violent and coercive content, the aliens' casual cruelty toward their prisoners, the mental domination played out on screen, several moments of overt sadism baked into how the antagonists treat their captives. Whether that was the whole story, or whether the kiss itself made broadcasters more cautious about defending the episode publicly is something fans and historians still debate. What isn't in dispute is that Plato's Stepchildren sat on the same list of officially unaired episodes as several others for decades, and it wasn't a small technical hiccup. It was a deliberate, long-standing editorial decision. There's an irony worth sitting with here. An episode remembered today as a milestone for on-screen representation was, for a huge stretch of its history, treated by a major broadcaster as too intense to show families at tea time. That gap between how a piece of media is remembered culturally and how nervous the institutions airing it actually were at the time says a lot about how differently controversial can be defined depending on which side of an ocean, or which decade, you're standing in. Beyond the kiss itself, the episode leans hard into the discomfort of watching characters lose control of their own bodies. The telepathic aliens force Kirk to slap himself, force Spock into an uncharacteristic, almost cruel emotional outburst, and generally spend the hour treating their captives less like prisoners and more like toys to be arranged for entertainment. Watching two of the show's most composed, dignified characters get reduced to marionettes is genuinely uncomfortable regardless of the era you're watching it in, and it's easy to see how a broadcaster already inclined toward caution might have looked at that dynamic and decided the whole hour needed to be quietly set aside. It's also worth pointing out that the episode's reputation has shifted over time in a way that complicates any simple story about censorship. Some later critics have argued the episode holds up poorly for reasons that have nothing to do with the kiss or the violence, pointing instead to some of its broader plot choices and performances as some of the weaker moments in the show's run. That means the ban itself has become almost more famous than the episode it was attached to. A strange kind of legacy where the act of suppression ends up mattering more, historically speaking, than the content being suppressed. So if that's episode 2, what earns the top spot on this list? Let's move on to the one broadcasters seem to have the hardest time justifying keeping off the air. This episode drops the crew into what might be the single grimmest setting in the entire original run of the series, a high-security psychiatric facility built to contain the most dangerous, criminally insane individuals in the Federation. The Enterprise is simply there to deliver medical supplies, a routine errand that turns into a hostage situation almost the moment Kirk and Spock beam down. The man running the show, in every sense that matters, is Garth Avazar, once one of Starfleet's most decorated and admired captains, now a patient at the very facility he's taken over. Garth has lost his grip on reality so completely that he now believes himself destined to conquer the galaxy, and he's acquired a genuinely dangerous ability along the way. He can shapeshift, taking on the appearance of anyone he chooses. He uses that power to impersonate the facility's own chief medical officer, manipulating both staff and fellow patients while he works toward seizing control of Kirk's ship. Once Kirk and Spock are captured, the episode shifts from a rescue mission into something closer to a psychological ordeal. Garth doesn't just want to defeat Kirk. He wants to break him, taunting him, staging mind games designed to prove his own superiority, and using fear as his primary tool for controlling the other inmates around him. In one particularly cold moment, he murders a fellow patient purely to demonstrate that he has the power to do so, with no larger strategic purpose beyond making a point. It's a level of casual, sadistic violence that stands out even against the show's other, more famous confrontations with tyrants and monsters. The episode's climax turns into a kind of identity puzzle. Garth uses his shape-shifting to impersonate Kirk directly, and Spock, who has to figure out which version in front of him is the real captain before making an irreversible decision, resolves it through cold logic rather than brute force. It's a clever structural trick, but it's built on top of an hour that spends most of its runtime in a facility full of unstable, dangerous people, dwelling on madness, humiliation, and violence in a way that reads as considerably darker than the swashbuckling adventure tone the series is often remembered for. That tonal shift didn't go unnoticed by broadcasters overseas. When British network censors evaluated the episode, they judged it too unsettling for the time slot Star Trek generally occupied, largely because the show was widely treated there as family or children's programming rather than the more adult-leaning genre entry it sometimes was. An episode built almost entirely around an asylum takeover, casual murder, and psychological torment simply didn't fit into that slot, and it joined the small group of episodes kept off the air for years. There's also a sexualized dimension to the episode that likely didn't help its case with the cautious broadcast standards department. One of Garth's fellow inmates, an alluring alien woman under his control, is used repeatedly throughout the hour as a tool of seduction and manipulation, dancing for Kirk in an attempt to distract and disarm him. Combined with the asylum setting, the murder, and the sustained psychological cruelty directed at Kirk throughout, the episode reads today as one of the more tonally aggressive entries the original series ever produced. A deliberate departure from the exploration of the week format the show is best remembered for, and a clear example of just how far the writers were willing to push an hour of primetime television in pursuit of a genuinely disturbing story. It's also worth noting how the episode's central villain complicates the usual Star Trek formula. Garth isn't an alien menace or an ideological extremist. He's a former Starfleet hero, someone the audience is told to have once admired, whose descent into cruelty and delusion makes the episode feel less like a monster story and more like a character study of what happens when brilliance curdles into megalomania. That makes the violence land differently than it might in a more straightforward alien invasion plot, because the audience is watching someone who used to represent the very best of Starfleet become one of its most dangerous threats. But this pattern of banned episodes wasn't some isolated incident. It points to something much bigger about how Star Trek operated from the very beginning. To understand why these 3 episodes in particular crossed a line, it helps to step back and look at just how far the franchise was willing to push things in the first place. Star Trek didn't set out to be safe. Gene Roddenberry, the man who created it, pitched the show to network executives using comparisons to familiar Western dramas, something he referred to, at least publicly, as a kind of wagon train adventure set among the stars, a pitch clearly designed to make the show sound less risky than it actually was. Privately, his ambitions were considerably bigger. He wanted each episode to work on 2 levels simultaneously: an accessible adventure story on the surface, and underneath it, something closer to a moral argument about how people ought to treat one another. That structure let the show smuggle serious ideas past network standard departments that might have rejected them if presented more directly. Set a story about racism on a distant planet populated by aliens who are half black and half white, and suddenly a topic that would have caused an uproar if tackled head-on becomes something a 1960s network will actually broadcast. Roddenberry leaned on this trick constantly, using alien cultures and far future settings as a kind of camouflage for stories about war, prejudice, authoritarianism, and the abuse of power. The show's optimism was deliberate too. Roddenberry envisioned a future where humanity had actually learned something from its worst mistakes, a species that had moved past its own history of cruelty and built something better in its place. The Federation itself was clearly modeled on the hope that different worlds, much like different nations, could cooperate rather than constantly fight for supremacy. None of that idealism came easily. Network executives regularly pushed back against Roddenberry's choices, including his insistence on assembling a genuinely multiracial cast at a time when that alone was considered a risk for a primetime broadcast. That same willingness to push boundaries is exactly what set the stage for episodes like the 3 we've just covered, a show that was actively trying to smuggle serious, uncomfortable ideas past network censors was always going to occasionally miscalculate how much discomfort a particular broadcaster was willing to tolerate. And when it did, the result was exactly the kind of quiet, long-term ban we've been discussing. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much weight this franchise ended up carrying, because it helps explain why these bans became such a point of fascination for fans rather than a forgotten footnote. What began as a single television series that only lasted 3 seasons in its original run eventually grew into one of the most extensive science fiction universes ever built, spanning multiple spin-off series, a long-running animated show, a string of feature films, and an enormous body of tie-in fiction.